Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. Earlier this month, the World Bank announced that it would scrap its Doing Business report and rankings. The decision comes as a result of an investigation prompted by internal reports of data irregularities in its 2018 and 2020 edition. According to an investigation conducted by a Washington-based law firm, WilmerHale, World Bank staff members changed data on China to improve its ranking on the ease of doing business. All this under pressure from the office of the then World Bank President, Jim Yong Kim, and the then Chief Executive, Kristalina Georgieva, and one of her advisors. Remember, in 3 reports released in 17, 18, and 19, India actually ranked amongst the top 10 economies, showing the most notable improvement. In fact, the report published in October 2019 placed India at 63rd in that ranking, compared with 77th in 2018 and 100 in 2017. So let's unpack this story further and go back to when the trouble started. In 2018, the World Bank repeatedly changed the methodology of one of its flagship economic reports over several years in ways it now says were unfair and misleading. The World Bank's chief economist, Paul Romer, at that point told the Wall Street Journal that he would correct and recalculate national rankings of business competitiveness in the report called Doing Business, going back by at least 4 years. But what was the main problem with this ranking system? The short answer: data manipulation. A detailed investigation by WilmerHale had many problematic and serious revelations. Number 1, for Azerbaijan in Doing Business 2020, the published score was 76.7, global ranking 34. After correcting the irregularities, the Doing Business 20 score was actually 78.5, meaning that Azerbaijan's global ranking would be 28, and it would have been on the list of top 10 improvers in the Doing Business 2020 report had those irregularities not occurred. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, in Doing Business 2020 saw a published score of 71.6, global ranking 62. Again, correcting for the anomalies, the actual score is 70.9, implying that it would not have been the top improving economy in Doing Business 2020. And the big one, China's global ranking in Doing Business 2018 would have been 85, a decline of 7 places relative to the previous year. When these irregularities were reported, it triggered a pause of the Doing Business report announced on August 27, 2020, as well as a review. The WilmerHale investigation showed 2 distinct types of pressure were applied on the Doing Business team by the bank leadership. There was both direct and indirect pressure to change the methodology so as to boost China's score, and number 2, pressure was applied by the CEO, allegedly Georgieva, and her associate Yankov to make specific changes in China's data points at the exact point in time when the country was expected to play a key role in the bank's capital increase campaign. So what about India? The headline takeaway seems to be that there was inconsistent application of methodology, but data was not manipulated. It does seem like the centre did try to game the rankings in a sense, pushing through reforms that looked good. So while other countries were directly pressurizing the World Bank, Prime Minister Modi seemed to be pressurizing his own bureaucrats to push reforms through to raise the ranking. For instance, one may ask whether the reason for the rush, and many would say shoddy job on GST, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and the corporate tax cuts were all done with an eye on the index. All these moves gave our country a lot of points and gave any country a lot of points in the ranking. Documents compiled by Huffington Post in 2018 actually show that the Modi government first sought to lobby the World Bank into changing its methodology to reflect a better rank for India. When that didn't achieve any significant success, the government then prioritized minor institutional and procedural tweaks to game the ranking system rather than embark on a bold agenda or a bolder agenda of economic reform as was promised. In former Finance Minister, the late Arun Jaitley's words himself, he said you have to literally crack the code. That's what he said at a press conference on the 31st of October 2018, the day when the index showed that India had risen all the way up to 77th spot from 100 in the previous year. Joining me now to discuss the index and all its takeaways is Jason Sandifer, who's Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development. Justin participated in an external review panel that was commissioned by the World Bank to look at the methodology behind doing business. The final report was submitted and finally released by the bank earlier this month.
Justin, thank you for taking time out and speaking with me. I want to set the context in terms of what you did and what you found. So you were part of this external panel review that looked at this ease of doing business report and index. Walk us through what your preliminary findings were and whether they were consistent with the WilmerHale investigation, which really saw things blow up in a big way for the first time.
Right. So the WilmerHale report has these explosive revelations about deliberate manipulation of the data by World Bank management. And that's the scintillating Hollywood stuff. Our report that I participated in as part of an external review panel was really looking at the underlying methodology of the index. Does doing business make sense? Is it coherent? Is it sort of academically sound and valid? And so it was a group of 6 academics going over the methodology. We were, commissioned by the World Bank to do that. We've spent the last several months going through the report and talking to people at the bank and country representatives and so on. Our findings were that there was the need for a fairly major overhaul of the methodology of the report. And that right now, we didn't feel that it was really capturing what it claimed to capture. And there were a number of reasons. We can get into some of those. But I think you could sort of divide them conceptually into 2 big buckets, right? One is kind of purely methodological, which is that everybody looks to ease of doing business and the doing business index as a measure of the costs that firms face. But really, the index was quite detached from reality. They weren't going out and interviewing Indian small and medium enterprises and asking them about their challenges at all. They were asking a handful of lawyers what hypothetically a firm would confront if it went through every hoop in front of it and complied with the letter of the law, which, as all your watchers know, is probably not how most businesses operate. If you did, you would never get anything done. And so there was that. It was a really hypothetical exercise. On the substantive side, I think our complaint was that doing business kind of comes from this approach that the only thing government needs to do for the private sector is get out of the way, which a lot of people have sympathy with. But, it was all about how many days does it take you to get a business registration, to get an electricity connection, to get a construction permit, and really no attention to other things government needs to do, like provide infrastructure and roads and bridges and ports, and ensure the rule of law and low crime rates and provide a skilled workforce and all the other things, positive things that the state needs to do to provide a good business environment were kind of systematically ignored by doing business. So those were our 2 sort of gripes, methodological and on the substantive coverage.
I'm going to talk about them in more detail, but first a broader question on whether what you found, both on the substantive side and on the way the methodology was set up, was bad enough for it to be scrapped. Was it really no good?
Right. So, we were a group of, in our panel, we were a group of 6 people chaired by Mauricio Cardenas, who was the former Minister of Finance in Colombia. And we had a very diverse range of opinions, So we didn't make any statement about scrapping doing business. And we put out our report before the WilmerHale, full revelations came out. Personally, my view is, in light of what has been revealed in terms of data manipulation, I think the underlying flaws in the index justified the decision to shut it down. And I think that requires some explanation, right? Because if you find out, in the Euro crisis, a decade ago, if we find out that Greece is manipulating its GDP data, the answer is not to abolish GDP in Greece. And if Argentina was manipulating its inflation statistics, the answer was not stop measuring inflation. The answer is to fix the problem, perhaps replace staff and, but come back with a new and improved series. I think in the case of doing business, so many stakeholders had fundamentally lost faith in the exercise. Folks within the World Bank who felt that it was a drag on their credibility, people in kind of the, on the board and in different countries represented at the bank who felt that this was really a political exercise now and didn't have any sort of integrity and legitimacy. So in that context, add on these explosive revelations about data manipulation, it seemed like it was time for a new approach.
The WilmerHale investigation was quite specific about what it found on different countries, most specifically so about China and the amount of manipulation that went down there. Were you in a position to backtest the data that you were looking at to see which nations had the widest gap between what was reported on the ease of doing business index versus what the real situation might be?
I mean, the short answer is no. I think the way that the China, Saudi Arabia, and Azerbaijan cases were caught and flagged, there was a whistleblower apparently within the doing business team, but there was a fairly high burden of proof there in that the version of the document which had been allegedly finalized and shared with World Bank management was then different from the one that we all saw in the public domain. There were last-minute unapproved changes for those countries. Some of the earlier allegations about what happened with the case of Chile and what happened, some things that I've written about a couple of years ago in the case of India were not about last-minute manipulation of the data, but about the way that changes in the methodology year to year created sort of spurious changes in the rankings. And so that's a little bit more subtle, but I think probably a little bit more relevant to the Indian case.
Some of what you've noted, though, Justin, is quite interesting in terms of the specific asks that the index had, because the then Finance Minister, Arun Jaitley, actually made that point at a press conference when he was announcing India's jump, saying, we've gamed it. Something like corporate tax cuts, for example, that immediately gave you a leg up, did it not? And it kind of tied in with the corporate tax rate cuts that happened in India.
Yeah, so I think there's two things to look at there. One is the sort of the hypothetical nature, and some of the somewhat arbitrary things that were in the index. I think many countries, possibly including India, began to look into the index and see, there's some stuff there that's really hard to change. And there's some stuff that we can do quite easily to sort of juice our score. If you have a website that does X, Y, and Z for the Revenue Authority, if you have these filing procedures, well, those things we can change at the stroke of a pen. That seems like a really easy way to climb up in the rankings. So there was definitely, I think, gaming going on, not just by India, but by many countries. I think that was in some sense legitimate. Those were the rules of the game as the World Bank laid them down, but I think it made the index less valuable as a result. The other thing that I think was particularly problematic in the Indian case, and I think the fault here lies with the World Bank, was that each year they would make changes to the methodology. Let's just assume for very good reasons, we want to add a new indicator, we want to change the weights applied to different things. And what happens then is that some countries are going to jump up and some are going to jump down. And you may not know which in advance. And so it kind of happened between 2016 and 2017 that they changed the methodology. And the result was to push India way up in the rankings. It was the year India went from 130 to 100. World Bank officials knew full well that had nothing to do with reforms. That was just an artifact of what they'd done to the weights in the index. And they could have gone in and said, look, everybody understand last year's not comparable to this year. But instead they went the opposite direction and put out a press release about India's amazing rise, And so they were very deliberately feeding the public misunderstanding of what the index was measuring.
Two-part question over here. One, can the kind of index that was constructed really work for all nations and all economies? As you said, it was a bit of, government needs to get out of the way, which doesn't always work in developed country economics. And the other, is it even ethical or fair for an institution like the World Bank to be producing this index when the member countries are often the key donors? I'm feeding you, and then I'm going to ask you to critique me.
Yeah, well, I think that last one is one of the real reasons that the index has been shut down, is that what happened with China and Saudi Arabia in particular illustrates that they just couldn't maintain good governance and a firewall between what contributors, donors to the World Bank, especially to IDA, the fund for the poorest countries, where the World Bank was really looking for China and Saudi Arabia to step up. They couldn't simultaneously, be begging for contributions from those countries and objectively evaluating their business climate. I mean, it gets even sort of a little bit more sinister than that in the World Bank also has a small arm which does paid advisory services, where countries, pay sort of fee for service for consulting services, essentially. And Saudi Arabia has always been one of those countries, one of the few countries that uses that quite a bit. And so Saudi Arabia pays for the World Bank to consult it on how to improve its business environment. And then the World Bank turns around and says, we're going to evaluate you on your business environment. Well, I'm not shocked that things went off the rails in the case of Saudi Arabia and doing business. But I think the first part of your question gets, is less political, and I think gets to one of the intellectual challenges is doing business index is different than, say, the Human Development Index that the United Nations puts out. United Nations says, we think countries should strive for higher incomes and longer life expectancy and more education. These are like goals and aspirations that we have. Doing business is much more ambitious in saying, like, no, we know the policies that you need to implement to achieve growth and development. But if you're going to do that, you really have to have a lot of confidence that the policies that are in your index, if you change them, they're going to have a causal effect on growth. You are implicitly giving really strong policy advice with this index. And I really don't think that the evidence, if you reduce the number of days it takes to register a business, does that mean you're going to get more business registration and more private sector growth? Maybe. If you slash the corporate tax rate extremely low, does that mean you're going to get higher private sector growth? Maybe. But the World Bank wasn't really bringing evidence to bear on these policy recommendations. They just kind of took a hard line that we want a more deregulated, hands-off approach. And without bringing further evidence, we're going to tell all countries at all levels of development that that is the priority right now.
Where do you think this will go, Justin? I mean, was this a cash cow for the World Bank? So does it look like it's going to come back in some shape and form? Because, for India, as you know, the macro data has been quite messy, and this ease of doing business index was something that was being tom-tommed as a big achievement. Do you think it's going to come back, or has it caused too much embarrassment to the bank to do that in a hurry?
That's a very good question. I don't know. I hear rumblings about, there's a desire to have something to fill the gap. Whether it's a new index, I hope not. But we'll see. It is certainly true that, the World Bank often touts the fact that doing business is its most downloaded product. And doing business, is always on the front page of the Financial Times and, international newspapers. And World Bank management loves that. The bank loves the attention that doing business generates. And so I think they're going to be quite reluctant to give that up. There's going to be the desire for another blockbuster product. I really hope that they don't succumb to that urge, though, because at the end of the day, this is supposed to be an impartial multilateral institution, and it shouldn't be putting out publications just for the clicks, kind of. It ought to be offering the best policy advice it can to every country in their specific context, and not sort of chasing these headlines with a blockbuster index.
Just one final question, and I know it's not data driven, so I'm asking you to go out on a limb a little bit. But on a scale of 0 to 10, what would you say is the actual correlation between this index's findings versus what was going on in specific countries?
Oh gosh. I'm going to be a little bit tongue in cheek, but I think I can make an argument that the answer is zero. For the following, and I do have some empirical justification, data justification for that. So the World Bank, in addition to doing business, also does something called enterprise surveys, where they do go out and measure and talk to firms, and they interview several hundred firms in each country, ask the managers similar sets of questions. How long did it take you to get a construction permit the last time you needed one? And so for all the countries in doing business, you can look at the correlation between what doing business says and what the actual firm managers said. And across countries, the correlation is literally zero. There's no relationship between those things. The experience of firms on the ground is just very different from these hypothetical scenarios that lawyers are giving the doing business team.
That's a slap on the face for the index that I think is as resounding as it can be. Thank you very much for joining in. I really appreciate your time and your thoughts. And I hope we see something more tangible from both the bank and from these countries. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
So, some key questions about India and this ease of doing business index come to mind. Number one, why was such a problematic index with clear flaws in methodology tom-tommed for so long by the Indian government? Number two, was there a frenzied focus on putting India amongst that top 50 countries category in the ranking, in a way giving the World Bank disproportionate influence in India's economic reform process and their decision making? There is also the question of whether the Modi government has preferred to focus its energies on optics instead of actual economic reform. And number three, is this another centralization by stealth move, where reform metrics are superimposed by the centre? States have now started signing MOUs with international chambers of commerce to actually move up the rankings. But most major business-related laws are from the union government, whether it is the bankruptcy code or GST or tax rates, and centralization is already underway on issues like land and labour. Several economists have pointed to the very real dangers of ignoring data compilation and not window dressing negative data. The biggest lesson from the ease of doing business fiasco for India remains focusing on the brass tacks rather than chasing false glory. Thanks for watching.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.